This week's episode of Couch Potatoes Unite! Is sponsored by Found Penny Studio. Found Penny Studio is exclusively fulfilling our Patreon Tier 3 merchandise perk by doing what they do best, creating to celebrate everyday moments like your favorite TV series. Check out Found Penny Studio's creations at foundpennystudio.com and find Couch Potatoes Unite on Patreon at www.patreon.com/couchpotatoesunite.
You say you want to watch a drama. You say you want to watch a comedy. Well, you can watch it with your mama. Or you can watch it with your daddy.
You'll even sit and watch it with your middle schooler. So you can come and talk around a water cooler. We're watching all day and all night.
Couch Potatoes Unite.
Whoa, whoa.
Couch Potatoes Unite.
Whoa, whoa. Couch Potatoes Unite.
Hello and welcome to a brand new episode of the podcast entitled Couch Potatoes Unite! Which is based on a blog of the same name because for us, it's like exploring and settling a new world. And it's a wilderness out there, let me tell you, but we're holding our own. Wouldn't you agree? My name is Kylie and I love TV. If you feel the same, keep listening and or checking out our website, couchpotatoesunite.wordpress.com, as you're bound to find some common ground or something you like. For Couch Potatoes Unite, we're all about the wonders and the unique long-form storytelling of the small screen. CPU! Hopes you've been following releases of brand new episodes of the podcast on Wednesdays, as well as new blog entries on some Tuesdays, and as always, we have several more new episodes on the way. Because the panelists and I live lives behind our podcast, the episodes are published once per week. Subscribe to the website or the podcast via iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, via Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, CastBox, and now Amazon Music to stay on top of brand new episodes. Episodes already published discuss a variety of shows around the water cooler, including, but not limited to, Supernatural, Orange is the New Black, Gotham, the Marvel shows on Netflix, Stranger Things, iZombie, Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, The Good Place, The Crown, Game of Thrones, American Horror Story, Grace and Frankie, Mr. Robot, Charmed, and Riverdale. Plus, new episodes are in the works, including revisits for Altered Carbon, Doctor Who, Schitt's Creek, Westworld, Fuller House, Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt, Will and Grace, Marvel's Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. We'll be launching new panels covering The Orville, Big Little Lies, The Good Doctor, Call the Midwife, and The Animaniacs. And because we look back at shows now past, we'll travel through time and experience all sorts of identities with Quantum Leap. We'll thank the Golden Girls for being friends, and we'll cry Bazinga for Big Bang Theory. By the way, did you know that CPU also from time to time goes live? We've been live from bunkers, comedy shows, Comic-Cons, and game stores. Plus, we're planning more live appearances and other cool stuff, including in these semi-quarantine times. So make sure you like or follow us at our Facebook page, our Twitter at CPU Podcast, our Instagram at Couch Potatoes Unite, or subscribe to our website, our YouTube channel, our Apple iTunes channel, our Stitcher Radio channel, or find us on Google Podcasts, Spotify, CastBox, iHeartRadio, and Amazon Music. In the meantime, if you don't hear a show in this podcast format, fellow panelists and I still write reviews, and we always seek new panelists. So if you have any interest in joining the discussion, say hello by finding us at any of those outlets I've mentioned. At the very least, stop by and leave us a thumbs up, comment, or review. We like feedback. Just keep your muskets and shotguns safely tucked away. Peaceful discussions will probably get you further, and that's true in life too. Today we're around the water cooler and continuing our catch-up series centered on a multi-season historical drama based upon a series of novels of the same name by Diana Gabaldon. The show is Outlander, and this is the fourth of a 5-part series in which CPU catches up on Outlander, which airs its primary run on Premium Network Stars. In this episode, part 4 of this series, we're discussing Season 4, which aired on Stars from November 4th, 2018 to January 27th, 2019, with a total of 13 episodes. We will discuss Season 5 in the final episode of our catch-up series. Developed by Ronald D. Moore, Outlander stars Katrina Balfe as Claire Randall, a married former World War II nurse who in 1945 finds herself transported back to Scotland in 1743. There she encounters the dashing Highland warrior Jamie Fraser, played by Sam Heughan, and becomes embroiled in the Jacobite risings. In Season 4, in the British colony of North Carolina, Claire and Jamie prepare to return to Scotland with Fergus, played by César Dambois, Marcelly, played by Lauren Lyle, and Ian, played by John Bell. Prior to their departure, Claire and Jamie visit the plantation of Jamie's aunt Jocasta Cameron, played by Maria Doyle Kennedy, where they see Jocasta owns slaves. Though Jocasta would have Jamie oversee her plantation when she is gone, objecting to the notion of slavery, Claire and Jamie decide to leave and to instead claim land offered them by the governor of the colony that they name Fraser's Ridge, land which is already inhabited by Cherokee. Meanwhile, in the 1970s, Brianna, played by Sophie Skelton, rejects Rogers, played by Richard Rankin, earnest marriage proposal. After learning her parents will die in a fire, however, Brianna travels through the stones at Craignadoon to warn them, and Roger, who learns of Brianna's decision, elects to follow her. Outlander was a show requested by a few like-minded Sassenachs and some of our resident couch potatoes, namely panelists Kristen, Samantha, Lori, Karen, and Anna Laura, all of whom have reconvened around the water cooler today, ready to discuss Season 4 of this wildly romantic tale of now 2 women who live in 2 different time periods, and the men who would love them. As always, it should be noted that all of our panelists have watched all episodes of this series at least through Season 4 and may discuss sensitive plot points. So for those of you who have not watched Outlander and plan to do so at some point, listen at your own risk as there may be major spoilers. Welcome back, panel! How are you?
Great. Doing great.
Are you sure?
It's fine. Everything is fine.
Okay. Well,
It's the night before election night, Kylie.
Oh, that's true. We are this will probably not publish in time for you to know this, but we are recording the night before election night, and we're hoping this bit of escapism will carry us through. Right, ladies?
Yeah, absolutely.
So to that end, what I'm going to do now is take your temperature along the standard CPU character question, which changes with each show we do, and I have managed to change it every season. Season 4, notwithstanding, also included, has been changed because there's more new characters and less of all the older characters, and the characters who are still around have changed. So now I got to take your temperature again. Are you ready for this?
Ready. Do it.
Right. So, with regard to Outlander Season 4, how did you feel upon watching it? Would you say you love the show, the fantasy aspects, the romance, and the appreciation and reverence for Scotland, plus the elements of action and adventure? All of it is just so exciting, even thrilling, and nothing like you've experienced before, which is enhanced even more by the new season set in the new world, quote-unquote, of colonial America. How could something feel so timely to the future when so much of it is set in the past? Aye, you could watch this for days, you can. Plus, the leading lady isn't hard on the eyes, like James or Jamie Mackenzie Fraser. Are you of 2 minds about this show? The past sweeps you off your feet unexpectedly, while the future brings with it aspects of intrigue as a mystical looking glass into the past. It's as if you're living 2 lives while watching this show, an experience that is full of surprises, but also offers the occasional storytelling hiccups. Still, you will persevere as you do for your love of one Jamie Fraser, like Claire Fraser. Did you start watching in earnest near the end of Season 2 and were enticed by the potential of learning the explanation for how Claire gets involved in all of this to begin with and how she comes to live 2 lives, including having a child with a father who lived 200 years in the past, but now you realize that you're invested in characters and romances beyond the 2 main characters, in addition to everything related to the family history associated with those main characters, like Roger Wakefield and Brianna Randall? Did you start watching the show beginning with Season 3, possibly because you were too young to appreciate the first 2 seasons, and are mostly enticed by the adventure, the sex, and perhaps on the more innocent side by the sense of family and the comfort that family provides, as any young adult just starting their life in the world might be, like young Ian Fraser Murray, the adult version of Claudel Fergus Fraser, and Marceline McKimmie Fraser? Though you were convinced to watch this show via nefarious or tricky means, believing it was something it wasn't, namely something that would most appeal to women, you find that it is so much more interesting and complex than for what you initially gave it credit. You're particularly taken in by Jamie Fraser's dashing good looks and seriousness of purpose, like Lord John Grey. Your interest in the show began to wane after watching the 3rd season, but then picked up again in the 4th season because you can't help but love the main characters and how much like family they are to you. Plus, stories set in the new world feel like new possibilities and new opportunities to reclaim what was lost like Murtaugh Fitzgibbons? Did you start watching in season 4 because you were more invested in and could relate more to the Brianna storylines than to anything else previously in the show? And if it wasn't for her presence as a character, you would not have been willing to watch it, like Lizzie Weymouth. Did you start watching around season 4 because you're more interested in American history and how the settlers interacted with the New World than in the history of Scotland? Plus, you're surprised and pleased by the show's willingness to show mature romances and unflinching portrayals of problematic social mores, like Aunt Jocasta Mackenzie Cameron. Did you start watching in season 4? And though, yes, you're late to this pithy and unnecessarily dangerous game, you recognize and enjoy the adventurous spirit of the show, though you could do away with all of the romance entirely. For you, the kill-or-be-killed stakes of Outlander makes the whole experience surprisingly rich, especially when the villains are neither obvious nor clear like Stephen Bonnet. Did you start watching in season 4 because you became intrigued as to how they would handle the stories of Indigenous American peoples and whether the portrayals would be sensitive? Mostly you're pleased with what you saw, though there was some definite quibbles to make along the way, like Adawehi, Keheratan, and Sadahoranies. Oh boy, I don't know if I even got those close. Have you long been obsessed with this show, but you've begun to recognize that the obsession is unhealthy because you dream of falling in love with Jamie Fraser, which can only be a product of your imagination, especially since he would never love you back as long as Claire is around, and so you're starting to think of watching something else in the end and giving up on your dream of Jamie entirely, like Larry Mackenzie McKinney Fraser? Are you watching the show, but the seasons set in America make you uncomfortable because of the inclusion of slavery and relations with Indigenous peoples, no matter how delicately the show attempts to handle these topics? And so you don't know how long you can or will stay committed to watching, like Ulysses, Phaedra, Wakatiosta, Tewasawakawe, Joe Hiehan, and Father Alexander Farrago. Did you watch an episode or two of season 4 just to see what all the fuss was about, and in the end came away sorely disappointed, like Gerald Forbes? Or have you mostly lost interest in Outlander because you don't like the direction of the story or the main character's choices, so you stopped watching altogether, like Janet or Jenny Fraser Murray? Or you've given it only a peek here and there just to confirm the fact that your interest has waned beyond the point of motivating yourself to continue to watch, and or that you're simply no longer interested in watching at all, like Ian Murray or the memory of Frank Randall. Who would like to start? I know they're so complicated this time.
I'll start since I have a super convoluted answer to your question.
Okay.
I wrote it down because I wanted to get this right. So last season,
What is your name?
Oh, this is Samantha.
Hi, Samantha.
Just so many names, I've forgotten my own in the process.
Got it.
To be clear, I'm still watching the show and interested in watching the show, but in breaking this down, last season I was Jamie and Claire. The first time I watched season 4, I watched it week to week, and this show, for me at least, really struggles with being watched week to week. It felt super fragmented that time, and had I not rewatched it like marathon style over a few days, my answer would be Ulysses and Phaedra and all of those other names I'm not even going to try to pronounce. When I rewatched it, binge style, I was back to being a Jamie and a Claire.
Okay. Do you want to qualify how you made that journey?
I'm not sure why I didn't like it as much the first time, other than just the week to week and not being, even knowing where things were going, having read the books. This season in particular was different enough that I wasn't sure where it was going, and I had trouble following it when I was watching it like in the standard format. It was easier for me to appreciate a lot of the smaller things that were happening on the second time around. One, because it was sort of a reminder, and I knew where the season was going then. And just not having that break, I think, allowed me to sort of stick with some of it. I mean, still, maybe I'll throw in a tad bit of Ulysses and Phaedra too, because there are things that are genuinely very uncomfortable from like a sex perspective, and then also just from a human perspective with slavery and the Cherokee and the Mohawk, and just like it still has an American bend to it, even though they handled it delicately. Does that make sense?
It does.
Oh, good.
Thanks, Samantha. Welcome back.
This is Karen. I'll go next. I also have a rather convoluted answer because last season I was almost 100% Jamie. I loved the first 3 seasons. I remember first time I watched the first episode of season 4, I hated it. I was Jenny Fraser. I was Jenny Murray. I was just appalled. I was going to turn it off, but I gave it a second chance. And by the time it got to episode 3, I was more Claire. So for the season as a whole, I'm probably 90% Claire. But I really do like what they've done with the American history and the introduction of the characters, even though some of it's difficult to watch. So there's a little bit of Jocasta Cameron thrown in there because I really like the way they've treated, and they did kind of get back to the book. The first 2 episodes were so hard because there were so many things that never happened in the book that were very just jarring for me. That's where I stand. Pretty much Claire, because I'm of 2 minds, the back and forth. You've got the future, you've got the past. There's always something going on that leaves Claire feeling unsure-footed. But definitely appreciating the history and the characters are woven into the story.
All right. Welcome back, Karen.
Glad to be back.
Hello, it's your girl, Anna Laura.
Hi, my girl, Anna Laura.
I, too, have a convoluted answer.
Oh, right.
It's the night for complicated answers. Complex answers to complex questions, or simple questions. Anyways, I would say for this season is where the interest level / my love for this show starts to take a bit of a nosedive. There's still a part of me, there's still a deep part of me that's a Claire. There's still a part of me that loves this show, that loves, certain aspects and elements of it, certain bits. I would say coupled with that part of me, it would be a young Ian, Fergus, and Marcelly, because I think my favorite parts of the season are when the family's all together, when they're doing their thing, because I think those sections of scenes are really great, and I love to see the family that they've built together, and you have this new generation coming up and their stories to follow. But on the flip side of that coin, I would say I'm a mixture between a Phaedra and Ulysses and Ian and Jenny Murray, because gold star for effort, E for effort, but there are certain things concerning the depiction of slavery and colonization, as well as some gender dynamics and stuff like that I think they tried, but they missed the mark. And it just doesn't sit well with me watching. So when I do rewatch, I generally cherry pick which episodes and which scenes I watched. For this, I did pretty much watch all of it, except for the parts that I absolutely could not stand to watch. But those things do definitely impact my enjoyment of the show and kind of start to make me feel a little bit uncomfortable.
Okay. Welcome back, Anna Laura.
Hi, I'm Kristen.
Hi, Kristen.
Hello. Last season, I believe I was still pretty much a Jamie and a Claire. I may have thrown in another character because that's my MO and that's what I always do. This season, I have slipped a little bit. I'm still a Claire 100%, but I do, as you put it in the description, I do have 2 minds about this show. I still think there are some really great moments, but there are some also moments in particular this season that really were difficult to watch and they did miss the mark. So that's where I will throw in a Ulysses and a Phaedra, just like others before me have said, for the exact same reason, so I won't rehash. I'm also going to throw in a Lord John Grey because Jamie is still delicious to look at. I also feel like some of the plot points, they're starting to be repeated a little bit. I can see that it probably will not be the last time certain story elements happen, but it's just getting to the point where I'm tired of the repetitiveness. So yeah, so a Claire, a Ulysses, and a Lord John Grey for season 4.
What a smorgasbord. Welcome back, Kristen.
And just following the trends.
Her trends, to be precise.
And I'll be the last to go. This is Lori.
Hi, Lori. Not quite the last to go, but...
Well, the last of your panel before you. I agree with a lot that was said before. It is disjointed. this is where we see some plot divergence from the books. So I agree that you're like, what's going on? I don't get it. Especially when one character is brought back. To put it into specific names at this point, it's a little more difficult. Like everybody says, they're a little bit of everything. I still enjoy the show. I think the cinematography and the music are still stellar, and the costuming. I understand that this is where it gets difficult with the colonization, slavery, indigenous First Nations. And so overall, I'm a split between Jamie, Claire, Lord John Grey, of course, and Ulysses with a little bit of Jocasta, because she's, in the books, one of my favorite characters on how she deals with things in a time period where women didn't have as much control.
Okay, welcome back, Lori. And of
You're
course,
making me feel better that we're all convoluted together.
I'm not going to be as convoluted. Of course, my name is Kylie. I both moderate and participate on this panel. Last time, and I think pretty consistently, I've been some combination of Jamie and Claire. Probably more heavily Claire. I'm still in the Claire camp, I would say. I would actually add Brianna and Roger, because I think I am starting to be a little bit more interested in romances other than that of the two main characters. And I also would add Jocasta, Aunt Jocasta, whatever her name is. To me, she's Catherine of Aragon from the Tudors, but whatever. That's where I know her from. I guess she was also an Orphan Black, but I've only seen like a couple episodes of that one. It's tough when... So we're going to talk about this, and I didn't read the book, so I don't have that perspective. So to me, it doesn't necessarily seem disjointed per se, but at the same time, we're walking into a period of history. One of the things that I kept thinking about was, as an American, I am far less interested in American colonial history than I am in the history of England and Scotland and the British Isles around the same time period. And there's a romance about British and Scottish history, even though it's quite violent and it's quite dynastic in its struggles, and you've got, internal fights for independence and that sort of thing. There's a romance about that side of the pond, and I couldn't help wondering if there's a similar romance looking this way. I don't feel that sense of romance about our colonial history. So I don't know if there's ever going to be a wonderfully comfortable way to watch slavery and the taking over of lands previously occupied by indigenous people. That's just part of colorful American history, and they decided to incorporate it on Outlander. So I don't know how I felt about that. I'm glad that our main characters took stances, and I like the fact that they were sensitive and delicate about it, but in the end, is it really what I want to watch? No, but I will say that a lot of the reunions in this, now again, I don't know if they happened in the books, but a lot of the reunions that I watched, I wanted, and I was like, oh yes, this is happening! So I was very excited about that piece. So I can't wait to talk about it. This is season 4 of Outlander. We're just going to continue along our catch-up series as we've been doing. We're going to talk generally about this season. I don't have a lot of probing questions, because I think the season can be probed, and you can take that however you like, can be probed in whatever way you deem fit, because I think there's a lot to talk about just in what the season discusses and how it's presented. So what did you like the most? What didn't you like the most? Let's talk about the convoluted, apparently, season 4.
My favorite moment, or really set of scenes, happens early in the season when Brianna and Roger are in the future, and he travels to see her, and they go down to North Carolina, and you have that duality of them being in roughly the same place as her parents in the past. And just
at a Scottish festival.
Yeah. Well, just their whole interactions where you have the history component more from our perspective through them, rather than seeing it during Claire and Jamie's time. And they're just so adorable together that when they get in that big fight, which they always just seem to get in fight after fight, and it's
Yeah, they fight a lot.
Get it together, like decide or don't.
They
or whatever.
fight more than her parents ever have.
Yes. True. And it's like, oh, it's going great. And then it's like, no, what are you doing? And they break it off because it's like, oh, this is such a nice moment up until then.
I think that's her trying to figure out her Brianna's way through a very changing world for women. She wants certain things. She wants to become, she's a mathematician, so she becomes, Karen, what did she end up becoming? She's
studying
engineer. Thank you. But she wants that romance. And how do you fight for one thing? That's how I always viewed her character, was trying to figure out her way in a very changing world in the 70s.
Well, and the fact that he's so traditional, and it's so, like, even when she wants to sleep with him and he's like, no, like, I actually love you, so I don't want to sleep with you now. And she's just like, what do you mean? So I feel like there's components of that even exist today when you have very modern women combined with sort of that traditional bending guys too. So that felt very familiar.
So I have a lot of feelings about that portion. I see, and like the first time I watched it, it definitely had an impact on me. But I mean, in the like almost 2 years since this season has aired, I have done a lot of deconstructing of the way that I was raised. I was raised in a very conservative evangelical home where purity culture was strong. And learning more about that and deconstructing that from my own experience, my own life, has been very good for me, thankfully. But especially rewatching, because that's one of the episodes that I generally skip through that whole section because, like, I don't care. Brianna and Roger fight way too much for me. So when they're fighting, I don't want to watch it. But I watched through it this time for the podcast. But the way that he talks to her in that scene, like, I'm not using this word lightly. I was legitimately triggered because that is how men in purity culture and just people who perpetuate those ideas generally talk and behave, where he's slut-shaming her. That's what's happening in that scene, which is ironic because she's the one who hasn't had sex and he has. So it is, to me, and I upon rewatch and realizing, remembering that this happens, I like Roger a lot less, because before I was like, oh yeah, they fight a lot, but they're cute. And then just remembering the way that he treats her and the way he talks to her this time around, he went way down in my esteem, because to me, it's so hypocritical and so sexist the way that he talks to her, saying, I love you, but I only want to sleep with you if we can get married. I only want to be with you if we're married and you're a virgin, but I'm not a virgin. And you have to be okay with that. Like, the double standard just leapt out. So those are my feelings on that.
What'd you say, Karen?
That was still very common in the 7.
Oh, yeah, it's very common today, hence why it affected me hearing that as an audience member so much, because even up to this day, I think purity culture has definitely waned a bit, especially I think with the resurgent, like a surge in a more progressive view of Christianity, which I partake in. But yeah, that attitude is still alive and well. And, that now the 2020s, especially the idea, not just that, oh, like, you're supposed to wait for marriage, the idea, because what it generally in practice ends up being is the women are the ones who are expected to be virgins on their wedding night. The women are the ones who are really being scrutinized and judged over this. The men, not so much. Like, if the men have slept around, like, boys will be boys, it's whatever. And yeah, and especially I think considering that in the first season, that dynamic was gender swapped with Claire and Jamie, where Claire was the one who was not a virgin and had a sexual experience before, and Jamie was not. And I think that was a really clever storytelling device on their part, and a really interesting way to look at that. And then now it just doesn't work.
I have several thoughts because the Brianna and Roger characters for me were probably more fascinating, and by fascinating I mean both in a good and bad way, over the course of this season than even Jamie and Claire. I love Jamie and Claire. I think by now they are a unit that is just going to face external obstacles. It's clear to me that maybe there will be internal obstacles later, but there were very few to none internal obstacles this season. It was all external obstacles, whether those were Brianna and Roger or the surroundings, the environment where they chose to make their stand in Fraser's Ridge. The things that I struggled with Brianna and Roger were less the sort of the social mores of it, because I think I was able to brain-wise say, well, this is the 1970s still, and this doesn't sound... And he's from Scotland, you know, it's not like that's a place of great progressive idealism on a normal day, much less in the 1970s. So when he was doing his business, sure, he was being an oaf, but I didn't have quite that reaction to it. At the same time, what I kept struggling with is, why would Brianna and Roger sort of make the decisions they would make in the moment? You know, why was she so not ready to get married up front? And maybe Lori's explanation suffices there. You know, she's a woman in the 1970s and things were confusing. But then she goes back in time and all of a sudden they're not confusing anymore, and they don't really explain that very well. Roger, on the other hand, you know, he gets the literal crap kicked out of him multiple times, all for the love of her, and then they have this big dramatic moment where he might not come back to find her in the end, despite the fact that he can, and they have to make it a big forced dramatic moment where he's riding over the ridge finally, when why didn't you just come back with Claire and Jamie like when they were there? So there were those things, but I generally enjoyed, and you're going to tell me something's not in the books, but I generally enjoyed Brianna and Roger going back in time. I loved that whole external piece the best on the season. I was so excited that Brianna found her real father and later called him Da. Oh, that was cute.
I do.
And that all happens in the book.
Okay, phew.
Yes.
Well, and I do I agree with you that it's really exciting to see the both of them go back, because then you have that added layer of these new people from the future going through the whole past thing. Like, Claire's over that, you know, she chose to go back. She knows what it's like living back then. There's no more insight from her of like, oh, this is the way it is, beyond the frustrations about medicine and the lack of knowledge there. You know, so you have these people to play off of each other that all are, it's kind of the inside joke of it, of like, oh, what do you miss? Oh, toilets, running toilets. And, you know, so you have that interplay that it makes it more approachable, at least for me to believe that they're back in time, because it's like, oh yeah, we do miss, you know, the stuff that we took for granted.
And I thought they created an interesting parallel between Brianna and Claire as far as their individual experiences. There's a lot of, they took kind of deliberate care with the characters in trying to draw, you know, here was what was similar to Mom, but then here's what's similar to Dad. And by Dad, I mean Jamie, not Frank. And I love how, even though maybe it was a little forced along the way, she kept encountering characters that they've already encountered, like Larry, for example. Don't like her, think she's a witch. She should be burned at the stake, okay? But that whole episode with Brianna and Larry having been the one who found her after she passed out, trying to walk across Scotland, what was she thinking? And then just, you know, taking care of her and her forming the bond with Joni, and then learning...
Adorable.
Yes.
I want more money.
Yes. I loved how they planted seeds and watered seeds from past seasons to remind us, oh yes, this is where we've been, this is how it's different. And, you know, Brianna, when she was first introduced, wasn't my favorite, but I really grew to like this actress and this character this season particularly, because I think her eyes were opened, and I don't know, it was kind of fun watching that mirror experience.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Brianna and Roger's storyline was much more compelling to me this season than Claire and Jamie's. Yes, I agree with Anna Laura. There were some parts of Roger's character not a big fan of, but there were also some moments where Brianna made some stupid decisions as well. Not that that explains either one of them away. But the real character that I kind of grew to immediately dislike was Lizzie, even though we shouldn't have. But, I mean, yes, innocent girl in the past, I get it. But only seeing one moment of what happened with Brianna and Roger through a imperfect glass window, how that just kind of ruined this whole season of Roger's journey. Oh, I just wanted to throttle her.
Yeah, that's
the same feeling in the book.
Yeah,
exactly. It's just one of the most, like, from Diana's perspective of the author, it's like, what were you thinking? Like, I get throwing roadblocks up and plot devices, but that one is so frustrating and so just ridiculous. It's like, seriously?
Well, and then it's exacerbated at Fraser's Ridge when she goes and tells Jamie that Roger's here, but they don't even check with Brianna to make sure that that's the guy. Because this was, months ago that Lizzie saw them through the window. It could have been somebody different. You know, Brianna obviously didn't offer an explanation of what happened. Lizzie just saw the after effects after Brianna, spoiler, was raped by Stephen Bonnet, who I also want to throttle. And yeah, that really frustrated me for Lizzie and Jamie at that point, because why wouldn't you at least check with your daughter or with Claire just to make sure? It could have, I mean, again, I know it's a device to give us more roadblocks and to give us more drama, but I felt that was so incredibly unnecessary of beating up Roger again and then tossing him away, and then he was taken up by the Native American tribe and taken up north in that whole journey. Oh, that was my least favorite part of this whole thing, was just how frustrated those people made me.
And it's very frustrating in the book, too, because it's exactly the same way in the book. Lizzie she's not a despicable character. She's just spineless. And you just want to throttle her because she won't stand up for anything. Mm-hmm. And she is the cause of the whole abduction of Roger and selling him. And yeah, the whole oversight is very paralleled between the book and, I mean, they did treat it very well in the series because it is written that way in the book. But it is a very frustrating part of the whole story of this season. There's so many things that happen that, had people communicated with each other, could have completely been avoided.
Yeah, that lack of communication was very prevalent, and it was a horrible theme to have throughout the story.
Oh, yeah. Especially coming from the aspect, too, that, like, yes, obviously they're enraged on behalf of their daughter/friend. Like, if something like that happened to someone that I knew and I thought I was seeing the person who had done it coming along the road to my house, like, yeah, I would also be angry. But at the end of the day, it wasn't me that it happened to. It should not be up to me what then happens. It should, because Brianna was the victim, she should be the one who gets to dictate how they move forward, in my opinion.
And again, you're still falling back into the mores of the times, which is women were property. Men were supposed to take care of things because women were their property. They were an asset. And if something happened to your woman, you went and took care of it as a man. Mm-hmm. And so part of that is watching Brianna come to terms with all of that in the whole process, where in the 70s, she's used to having her own voice, and then she goes back to her, and nobody pays any attention to her except for her mother. We all know what's better for you than you know what's good for you. Yeah, and exactly her frustration with that.
Well, that's why through that whole interlude, I was even though it's so typical for how he would have acted, but really disappointed in Jamie. Of one, jumps off the handle, gets it wrong, and then as soon as there's that confusion where, everybody starts to figure out what went wrong, and immediately he blames Brianna. Oh no, you lied about being raped. and all that. And that was, I think, one of my, even though it's a tough scene to watch, one of my favorite moments of her when she stands up for herself.
Oh, yeah. And it's so crazy, too, because, like, remind me if I'm wrong, but, like, I think it's, like, within the same episode where earlier they're having, like, that heart-to-heart where he's like, no, you could not have fought this man off. Like, it's not your fault that this happened to you. Like, you know, don't beat yourself up for it. Like, this is on the man who raped you. Like, don't, you know, victim blame yourself. And, like, in that part, I'm like, yeah, like, 10 out of 10, Dad. Like, great job. Like, that it wasn't her fault. She, you know, couldn't do anything to, you know, overpower this person that was physically stronger than her. And then within, I believe, the same episode, later, he's like, oh,
Yes.
you just lied because you're pregnant and, you know, you didn't stay with the guy. So then you said you were raped and you're like, dude, you were doing so well. And then
It feels
you had
so
to be a dum-dum.
Yeah.
That man.
But Jamie still struggled with, Claire has tried to enlighten Jamie, but he still struggles with the way he was raised and the mores of the times.
Oh, yeah. And, like,
And that's that whole dichotomy.
oh, yeah. And, like,
Not
I mean,
necessarily surprising, but at the same time, just as a viewer, just like, really?
yeah. I get it, but also it's like, it's still frustrating, you know, like it mostly makes like narrative sense and like makes sense for the character, you know, as you said, like how much, because he's been, I guess, educated by Claire on gender theory. She should have brought back some like Simone de Beauvoir, but
She's only got so many pockets in that cloak, Anna.
he needs to bring back some feminist lit. Okay, we need some de Beauvoir. We need some of the second sex. We need Mary Wollstonecraft. I mean,
She
Mary
opted
Wollstonecraft
for
will be
modern
writing.
medical supplies, okay?
Will be writing in like 30 years, like, you know, 20, 30 years after this season takes place. They gotta pick up, you know, a copy of the Vindication of the Rights of Women. Okay. Obviously, Claire and I would have different priorities traveling back in time. However, I think, honestly, watching this, I was reminded of some of the men that I know in the year of our Lord 2020. There are a lot of men even now who, as they start to learn about gender inequality and feminism and the different ways that men and women have been treated both throughout history and are still being treated on the basis of gender now, there are times where they do really well with that, where they, you know, are advancing and maturing and learning and being good allies to the women in their life. But then there are other times where that kind of, I guess, baseline of the way that they were raised in the more patriarchal and then obviously at sometimes misogynistic and sexist way of operating, like they still fall back on that sometimes. So yeah, I think from a character standpoint, it does mostly make sense that this happens for Jamie, especially since he's living in a time period where it wasn't really expected of men to start to think about these things. It's still a highly, highly patriarchal society, and he's definitely very unique in the fact that he's learning about these things, and he is taking these things into account as he goes about his life and as he interacts with his wife and his daughter. I can imagine what this series would have been if, like, Claire was like, hey, maybe like don't just like be a part of this patriarchal society, like maybe just don't feed into that. And he was like, no, like this would be a very different series if Jamie had not matured on that front. So thankful for that. But our boy still does slip up sometimes.
So I'm the outlier. Could care less about Brianna. I don't like the character. I don't like her in the book. I don't like her in the TV series because I think she's a whiny, indecisive individual. And she does bring about her own problems sometimes not. But the one thing they that I don't think they get right is her and Jamie's relationship as compared to the book. There's a heck of a lot more fighting going on in the book as she's trying to assert herself with a father that is antiquated and patriarchal. I just don't like her character. I like him more than I like her, which is sad because I think he has more of a journey, not Jamie. Roger. He has more of a journey than Brianna ever does.
Well, that's true in the literal and emotional sense, I would say. I don't have the book perspective, and I can see why you would have thought of that. I know you said something very similar when she first arrived in season 2. We were kind of talking about her, and I didn't have any strong feeling, but I could see why you thought that back then. I think I'm less in that camp right now just because I think they played her... I think they refrained from making her go over the top, and it was their scene. I think their scenes together, Jamie's and Brianna's scenes particularly, and then sometimes adding in the others of the family, were my favorite ones of the season. Just because I was so thrilled by this reunion, and I thought it was... I don't know if this was in the books. I thought it was hilarious that she discovers him in Wilmington, North Carolina, while he's peeing in an alley. And they managed to turn something that was...
It's in the book.
Okay. They managed to turn something that was a little clowny and ridiculous to watch into something totally heartfelt and sweet. I know because of the versions of the episodes that I saw, I won't say how I procure them, I was able to see the stars tag-alongs, that, the after the episode business for a lot of the episodes. So I did see after the episode in which they're reunited how they kind of took very careful care to make sure that certain beats were exactly like the books because it was such an important reunion, including Claire coming around the corner and there they are sitting on the bench. I thought all of that was very well done, and it really plucked at my heartstrings quite a bit, and I cried a little bit and was very happy because I was like, see, look, things can happen in Outlander. It isn't just all heartache and sorrow. So I don't mind her. I think she grows. She seems to grow in this season. I'm sure there's more seasons, so I'm sure she'll keep growing. And Roger does grow too. Again, he's got to get the crap beat out of him multiple times by multiple parties, and he's apparently dragged hundreds of miles from North Carolina on foot to upstate New York, but I still enjoyed that tension because I think for me it was different. Watching Brianna and Roger was a different story, finally, than Claire and Jamie. I do agree with Kristen's earlier comment that as much as I love watching Jamie anytime, any place, a lot of their story is starting to feel a little repetitive. It's the same cycle of something is making us have to face all of this danger, and they need the conflict or there wouldn't be a story, but it's the same group of reactions that those two characters have. So to throw some others into the mix kept it fresh for me. So let's talk about, now you all alluded to in your dance of the convolution, the many historical aspects of this particular season, which of course is set in colonial America pre the American Revolution. So slavery is alive and well, hostile relations with First Nations, indigenous peoples, very much happening. We see that by meeting Jamie's aunt, his mother's sister, Jocasta, as we've mentioned, played by Maria Doyle Kennedy, who has married thrice and one of her husbands left her a plantation. That's where they take some refuge when they're thinking they're going to go back to Scotland, and then they make a decision to stay in America. Let's talk about some of that. Now, I will say, I'll lead this one off, that some of the interactions with the Cherokee, I would say, reminded me a lot of Dances with Wolves. So it had been done before. They called them Bear Killer. They gave him a name.
Sorry to interrupt. It kind of interrupted you. My roommate, who does not watch this show, knows absolutely nothing about it besides being the victim of my rants. So you guys are not alone in that. She's a historian. She does a lot of stuff with history, so she has that perspective. But she, while I was rewatching, saw some of those scenes from the earlier episodes, and she was like, "Oh yeah, like they do the whole like, oh, they're like intimidatingly lined up on their horses on the ridge, and they come riding in, and like the settlers are like, oh, we have to arm ourselves to protect ourselves, but like we come in peace. And it's like, do you though? And they do like the whole intimidation thing, and then like you said, like they give him a name and like all this stuff, and like it definitely felt like, I know the book was written in, what was it, 96 the book came out? Any book readers remember for sure? I think I saw that date, which coincidentally was the year I was born.
We don't need this kind of negativity, Anna.
me and this book are the same age. Now, if I was born like before, like just before or just after the book came out, I'll have to look that up later. But like I get, like, the book was written in the 90s, and I think that may be one of the reasons, like you said, like it feels like Dances with Wolves. It feels like it kind of has that depiction, a lot of those same beats and a lot of those same tropes. But again, this show came out in the year of our Lord 2018. I feel like some of that could have been maybe not necessarily like changed. I feel like they could have handled it a little bit differently. I don't know. I feel like as far as the Native American representation in this show, I got more than I was expecting. I was kind of expecting the bare minimum, which is what, unfortunately, a lot of movies and TV shows have given us. I appreciate the fact that they are very obviously depicting specific tribes. They're not just like, oh, the natives. They're like, here we have the Cherokee, here we have the Mohawk. These are the different ways that these tribes dressed, the languages that they speak, the names that they have. I appreciated that, but I feel like in some of the like story beats and tropes, the way that they were depicted kind of felt like some of the same old.
Yeah, I'll build off on that for a quick second. The one thing that I did appreciate was the accurate representation with the casting, that they were very intentional about casting First Nation actors and actresses. I think what I read in a news article when I was watching this is they cast 200 actors, First Nation from Canada, and they actually flew them over to Europe where they were filming to make sure that they had it as accurately represented as possible. So I do appreciate that they took that step, and it wasn't just casting individuals who looked closely enough, but they actually went and got people from the First Nation tribes in Canada and employed them.
I liked that too. And I was less bothered by the Native American aspect as I was the slavery. Like, I liked some of the tropes to me were softened by like the Otter Tooth storyline, where it was less sort of the American perspective on them, and they sort of internalized it a bit. I wish they would have done that more. Like, it felt like it was just like, okay, Otter Tooth was in the book, so we got to throw that in there because it's important to the long story. I don't think they spent enough time on it.
I agree. That was
understand what was happening in that camp with Roger. It was more about, we got to find him, bring him back, and he was just on survival. So I wish, as frustrating as that whole storyline was, I wish they would have done more from the Native American perspective.
Yeah, I agree with that, because that's really interesting from the perspective that, there's another time traveler. Here's another person from the 1900s, from like the mid-20th century, who has traveled back in time to roughly the same time period. And also another person who Claire she didn't do it like on purpose to try to make the Scottish uprising either not happen or be successful, but that's kind of what she ended up doing, where she ends up trying to work so that people who are being colonized can be saved, and so that their culture can be preserved and not wiped out by the British. Ottertooth is, they're doing the same thing. Essentially, he's, I believe, purposefully went back in time to try to prevent his culture being wiped out. And just like for Claire and Jamie, it doesn't work.
The analog for Ottertooth is Gellus. Those are the two that make very purposeful decisions about going back in time to change the future of their people. And
you're right.
I agree. Ottertooth was not focused on. Like, I nearly forgot that she had that stone or had encountered that skull, because they did not mention it again until the very last episode of the season. To me, I look at the season as kind of 3/3. The first third being, oh, we're traveling through to North Carolina. We've stopped at the plantation. Slaves. Oh, no. The next third is, we're going to go settle at Fraser's Ridge. In the meantime, Brianna and Roger are traveling to America. And then the last third is reunion, Roger's kidnapping. And most of that time is spent chasing Roger up to New York. And there's that whole episode that he spends with the Mohawk, and none of that Ottertooth story comes out. It's not until they see Claire wearing the stone. So I was surprised when it came back up, because I was like, oh, apparently that was important after all. And maybe it'll come out further in season 5. I don't know. But for the moment, it felt very like, did you forget about that? Like, what the heck? It seems like it was important, people. And I did have a problem with that piece.
Well, this season could have maybe used an extra episode or two to flesh out some of that.
Or rearrange some of them and maybe not spent so much time on some other things.
Yeah.
One of the storylines that kind of gets pushed to the back in the show is Ian's story. And I miss that, because I think his story is very poignant in going from one culture to another back, and his trials and tribulations. I find him much more fascinating.
Ian's story doesn't really, I was going to say, Ian's story actually develops in C5. His story.
But in this season, he's just kind of like a tag along.
Yeah.
Right. I find that these stories intertwine in ways that people, like you said with Ottertooth, that you don't understand until another point. George R. Martin's like that as well. But I agree, it's still disjointed.
Yes, George R. R. Martin is like that, but I think when we're talking about, book to show adaptation, you might be watching as a book reader Outlander and thinking, oh yeah, there's that Ottertooth, and this is going to come out at some point, and I have some idea of when that's going to happen. Whereas for a non-book reader, when I was watching it completely fresh, it felt like a dropped plot point, and it had very little payoff when it came back. And the Game of Thrones TV adaptation, which, as you know, I'm extremely fond of, and perhaps fonder than most people because they didn't like the ending, blah, 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 blah. They took a lot more deliberate time in their adaptation of drawing in certain elements of the book and planting them in ways that even week to week you didn't forget about them. I binge watched this in a weekend, and I forgot about Ottertooth by the time they brought him back up again. So to me, that's an adaptation problem. That's not necessarily the stories or the book problem.
Oh, definitely. And that's where I would be curious, because, up until this season, this was where I was closer to reading the book and then watching the show to have that frame of reference, that even as I was watching it, there's so much missing in comparison that I was thinking of, like, the viewers like you. It's like, you're probably like, what is even the point of this ghost in the woods thing? Because there's not that context.
It was really...
Like they drop in the fillings, but they don't even, like, you don't know what time he's from really, and the motivations and stuff. Not like there is with Galus.
Well, and when he's introduced, it is intriguing because he is a ghost in the woods. She loses time. She's led from being lost in the woods in the rainy storm to finding Jamie and not even realizing how she got there. And I thought, oh, that's an interesting little twist on this mystery. I'm wondering how they're going to develop it. Well, they didn't. They didn't even develop it. And the context was it was all told. You got a little bit of the post-opening credits glimpse of the future Ottertooth. That was it. And then otherwise you had Jo, whichever her name is, I think. I don't remember which person it was in the Mohawk tribe, is basically the one, the woman that sits at the fire, is basically the one that tells the story. And that's in the season finale.
And then you've got that little bit after the title sequence, how he looks there compared to how he looks with the black makeup on. If I didn't know that those were the same people, like, that title sequence is is sort of pointless from my perspective, because unless you already know that that's a thing, it doesn't mean anything at all.
Yeah. At the same time, they spent a whole episode on Roger's captivity with the Mohawk and him trying to escape and being with the French Father Alexander, who fell in love with Jo Hyehan. I remember her. And, you know, who had the baby, and all because he won't baptize this child, and his potentially torturous end of life. And there's a little bit of intersplicing with Claire and Jamie and young Ian coming north. But otherwise, that's the whole episode, and it doesn't actually give us much of a point other than the fact that they find a reason to escape to each other. It was very divisive. It just felt like, unlike in previous seasons where things felt a little bit more seamless, disjointed has been a word used. I think that's correct. It's very like jerky the way these things are presented in season 4. Which isn't to say that I hated season 4, but these things that we're talking about particularly were like, that felt like potential that was unrealized.
Well, and I think this is where the show starts to diverge a ton from the books. Because in the early seasons, they would maybe pull a few nuggets forward to help give context. In comparison, this is where it goes like off the rails, where they're no longer following her volumes as she's laid them out. So I think some of that, to your point about an adaptation problem, it's like,
you pulling a lot of information from book 5 to set up things in season 4 that will happen in season 5. And that's why it feels so disjointed, because you're getting little hints right now of things that are going to come next season, but there's no explanation. It's just setting groundwork,
which is, you know, what they did from season 1 to season 2, but it didn't feel so disconnected, and I really don't quite understand why, since it's the same people. You know, I would almost think that it's different showrunners, but you have consistency. Oh, it is different showrunners now?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I thought it was the same consistent people, like writers and producers, though.
No, it changed dramatically after season 3.
Oh.
On season 4.
Well, I'm going to research that.
You get a different feel.
Yeah. Interesting. I'm going to look that up and compare it, because if that's the case, that would explain it quite a bit. And it means that the prior people didn't compare notes with the present people. And I just hope it pays off in season 5, some of it.
Could this also be...
Season 5 gets better.
Okay.
Could this be... I was going to say, could this be a result of them not knowing how many seasons they have left to finish telling the story? Do you think they're maybe trying to squeeze more things in or pull more things forward, not knowing if, was it season 6, maybe their last, or if they have more beyond that?
Starz is not going to cancel this show. It would have to be the show's decision. Starz had no profile until Outlander came along.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, no one had ever heard of it before this show. So this is like their flagship original. And it worked out pretty well for them.
This is their Game of Thrones, basically. Which isn't to say that HBO was unheard of, but people were not subscribing to HBO until Game of Thrones came along.
Right.
So
yeah, it's a game changer.
Yeah, I've read rumors but they're from really unsubstantiated fan magazines. Season 6 might be the last. Season 7 might be the last. I'll believe it when I hear it, because Outlander's too popular.
I would not trust anything that's not, like, from Starz, like, or from the producers, because, like we've been saying, I think it's highly unlikely that they're going to cancel this show prematurely. Honestly, if I have any fears, it would be on the opposite end, that they might try to overstay their welcome. I know Diana Gabaldon is still writing books, and of course there's a whole Lord John series, but they could, like, potentially adapt. So they still definitely have a lot of material, because I think the upcoming book is book 9, so they still have plenty of material to go for now. But yeah, I don't think this show is going to. I think this show will be around long enough for the lead actors to actually age into the ages that they're supposed to be playing, which I know was a little bit of a gripe from last time.
I guess
They do get the makeup a bit better this time with the graying of the hair and
Yes. Yeah. The graying hair, and like they look like their faces look just like a little bit more worn, you know. There were still times where I'm watching them, especially watching them interact with either Brianna or like Ferguson Marcelly, where you do you're kind of hit in the face with like, yeah, these actors aren't that much older than each other. Like there's still like a solid at least 10 years between them, but you're still just kind of like, oh, they don't look that much older than them, and they're supposed to be playing their parents. Oof.
But they aged Murtaugh well.
They aged Murtaugh super well.
You know?
dashing man.
No, like, Murtaugh was not, like, Murtaugh's dead in the books. I know that. I understand that.
Yes.
For me, I like talking about, like, disjointed plot points. Again, not a book reader. I've only read the first book. That didn't seem super disjointed to me, adding Murtaugh back in. And I think it helps flesh out the family aspect as well. You know, they have this kind of uncle / grandfather almost figure there with them. So, and yeah, they aged him super well. But he doesn't, I mean, he's not necessarily supposed to be this, like, sex symbol like Jamie is, or Claire.
All I have to say is that I was so giddy because at first I didn't realize who it was. They did a brilliant job directing his re-entrance. And I was like, oh my gosh, it's Murtaugh! And I was very excited.
And where young Ian, like, oh, like, he's charging too much, like, he won't, like, let me do this. And, like, he's like, oh, like, get away with you, young lad. And like, because, you know, in young Ian, like, they don't know each other, and then young Ian goes back to Jamie and is like he won't do this, like, you know, all this stuff. And then Jamie goes back, and then it's Murtaugh, and like they have this studio. I love the way that's shot, and the way that scene takes place.
Completely manipulative, and I loved every minute of it.
But it also changed.
They used Murtaugh as a
What did you say, Karen?
Go ahead. I was going to say they used Murtaugh as a plot point. They basically merged 3 or 4 different characters into Murtaugh's character. So there are characters who have important things to do who don't even show up in the series. It's all Murtaugh.
And they changed Jocasta's storyline to fit in with Murtaugh instead of who she really got along with, which was her head butler.
As in Ulysses?
Yes.
Oh.
Her and Ulysses have a thing in the books.
And that's why he won't leave, because he is offered freedom, and it comes back around later. But, yeah, and that kind of bothered me that they changed that plot point, because it's a reflection of something taboo that they overlooked or changed.
Well, and felt a bit whitewashy too.
Yes.
Yeah.
More than a bit.
Yeah,
I mean, I love Murtaugh. Don't get me wrong. I love his character, and I liked how they did end up doing it. But there was such a beautiful relationship between Jocasta and Ulysses, and how much he really ran everything. Only thing she did was, she would nod, and she was educated, don't get me wrong. But he took care of the day-to-day, which adds another layer of the whole slavery and where you rank. And that's uncomfortable, too, that, you have this African at that time, butler, who oversaw other slaves.
Well, that actually makes me have severe pause, because first of all, I already felt that the slaves with names in this series were a bit two-dimensional. And now you're telling me that there was a third dimension for at least one of them that they just completely ignored. Now maybe it'll come out in the 5th season. I know these characters stick around. I don't see that in the 4th season, so that's one thing. And then the other piece is I think they built on, there was a palpable chemistry between Maria Doyle Kennedy and whatever his name is that plays Murtaugh. I mean, it was a very, they clearly saw something I saw, and it kind of dripped off the screen. So I'm not surprised that they sort of pulled them together. But learning this makes me a little sad, because if you're going to explore those times, you might as well go full force. And white owners and having relationships with their slaves was quite the thing, and I'm using relationship very loosely there, was quite the thing at the time, so that actually would have been more historically accurate, and also would have given Ulysses, who seemed, the gentleman playing Ulysses seemed like a potentially good actor who had very few things to say and very little to do, and I thought, well, he seems pretty distinguished, and he's not doing anything. So it makes me sad that there wasn't more. So now I realize there is more. They just chose not to show it, at least now. That makes me mad, actually.
Did they allude to Murtaugh and Jocasta having a sort of relationship in an earlier season? I feel like I remember that, but I could be making something up.
They talk about how he flirted with her very much, but she and I...
The whole thing with the sisters, like,
yeah, he flirted
wanted
with both
his attention, but
Jocasta and Ellen.
But he was only interested in Ellen. And...
Right, but Ellen didn't marry him. So that's how he became Jamie's godfather, because clearly cared about him, just not the way he cared about her. And now there's some sort of weird transference again to sister. So
It's like Little Women.
That is the most confusing book and movie and play. Like, I know this is a total tangent, but I keep trying to
the movie and the play.
Oh, I love
every
it.
iteration I've seen of it, by the time I get to the end, I'm just like, why?
I have a lot of
But
feelings.
I digress.
Like, all of them are, necessarily positive. But I do love Little Women. I love the book. I love the 1995 movie. That was my childhood. And then the more recent film version it's one of my happy movies. And I think the reason that it's on the brain is because one of my friends just watched it for the first time last night and was essentially live messaging me his reactions, but he'd never experienced the story before. My personal favorite text was, she burned Joe's novel. What the no! And I was just like, oh, honey.
This is for our Little Women podcast that we probably won't do unless it becomes a TV show. Guys, we can do a book report on Little Women later on.
There's a TV adaptation. There's the PBS TV adaptation.
All right, I'll start a list of Little Women panel, and Anna will be the first name on it.
Don't put me on it unless you want, a contrarian view.
Regency. That's how I feel about all of Regency.
Little Women isn't Regency, it's Civil War.
But literally every time, Anna Laura, I get to the end, and I'm just like, why?
Let's come back to Outlander, because
I'm sorry.
I feel like Little Women is a little too far off the railroad track.
That's fair. I'm sorry.
Yeah, we got to get through the Revolutionary War. Civil War.
Okay, I'm going to go to my favorite part in the book of this book and Aunt Jocasta. It's the whole skunk incident. In the book, it is frickin' hilarious about how these people who don't know what a skunk is are affronted by the smell, thinking they're going to go hunt this huge animal, and it's a cat-like creature. And they only allude to it briefly, but in the book, it was a little bit bigger scene, and it was hilarious because you just see these brawny Scotsmen going out for battle against the skunk. Purely an American animal, and it's one of those brief moments where you go, oh, what would it be like to meet your first skunk? What would it be like to eat certain foods that hadn't traveled over yet? And, Jocasta's just like, they're going to go make fools of themselves. But I also like her character because she is a lone woman in a men's world on a plantation trying to get by.
And she's very wily, which we don't get to see a ton of other than her orchestrating that dinner party. And like, oh, I don't care that your parents are off finding your man. I'm gonna get you a husband.
I must mention that the character of Gerald Forbes was played by none other than Billy Boyd, who plays Pippin Took in The Lord of the Rings, and who I met at a Comic-Con. He's very sweet.
Ooh.
He's just
He seems like he was a sweetheart.
Oh, he and funny. He's hilarious. He told a lot of stories. In his big panel, he had Dominic Monaghan call him on a cell phone. He played Mary, of course. It was a lot of fun. But when he cropped up, I was like, it's Pippin!
Me too. I was like, Peregrine Took, is that you?
I was. The fact that he was the rejected one was even funnier.
It was so perfect because it's such like a different character from Peregrine Took. You know, he's a little, I guess you can say, like, self-important. He's a little bit of a dandy. He says he's stuffy. Yeah, and Peregrine Took is just like, you know, well, I mean, you get Merry and Pippin together, and they're just like a tornado of energy, and, you know, hijinks ensue. So that was funny to me to see him in a much different role than, you know, the one that we all know him from.
Informal question. How many of you on this panel have I done the Forest game with? Just Kristen? So, Kristen, let me ask you, in watching the scene at the dinner table when Brianna starts asking
I thought of you, and I explained it. I was watching it with my husband, Zach. We watched the show together, and when that came up, I'm like, Kylie did this with me! And he's like, what are you talking about?
And complicated in depth, but...
yes. So I'm like, I know this, and I tried to explain it to him, and I gave a really horrible explanation of what the Forest game is, and... yeah, so you'll have to explain it to him the next time you see him. But
I loved that scene. I loved the entire... It was hilarious to me that... Not hilarious. It was funny, but it was in a kind of a wry smile sort of way that Joe Costa's immediate thought was, oh my gosh, you're here and you're pregnant. We need to get you a husband because the one you love is probably dead. Let's just face it, niece. Okay? And
Practical. She's practical.
Yes. She calls... Yes, pragmatic, and she calls all of these eligible suitors in, including the one lieutenant that was in love with her for a while. That was pretty funny. And then who should appear in the doorway but Lord John Grey?
Goodness for Lord John.
Hearts.
For all the reasons.
I know. He's really become one of my top 3 favorite characters.
Oh, he only gets better.
Oh.
It only gets better with him.
I should have expected that he would walk back in the doorway and agree to be her fiancé, but it was so prickly there for a second that I was legitimately scared. Like, oh, come on, Lord John. You're more gentlemanly than that, and she's going to let you have sex with whoever you want. Just come on on. But then he did, and it was okay.
Yeah. I love the scene where he comes in and Billy Boyd is about to propose and just gets the wind taken out of his sails. That is a fun scene for me.
And Joe Costa whispers in her ear and says, I don't know how you managed to pull it off, Jerry, but good. And then she's like, congratulations.
Like, oh, okay. Like, sure.
It's one of many times where John Grey uses his status to help out Jamie's family. And it's very evident it's not for who he's saving, it's all for one person, the love of his life.
He's such a good dude. I love Lord John.
His books are funny. I love his books. You really get to get a better idea of the hidden side of Lord John.
No, quick question, just because I'm curious. With Lord John's book series, does it parallel the Outlander series, or is it totally separate?
At times it parallels, but it goes through the same time period and what he's all doing behind the scenes, because he's more than what he appears. I don't know if it would be a big spoiler about, but he's a master spy.
Okay.
So I don't know if that's...
I'll probably never read the books, let's just be honest.
I don't know where Outlander's going to go, because we're just pushing the revolution. So I don't know where Gablodon is going with some of these characters. So I
Well,
don't
you
know.
did just spoil one thing. The smudged out date is apparently 1776. Not 1770.
Not necessarily.
I don't know that that's the case.
Yeah, that's
I don't remember.
not in the show. It hasn't been established when that supposedly happens.
All I'm saying is, Lori just mentioned we're close to the revolution, so it's clearly past 1770 and a lot closer to 1776.
And we just met George Washington, didn't we?
Yeah, we did.
Yeah, we did meet George Washington.
Did, yeah.
I don't think the actor
And
looked
several
like him.
other actual real characters made an appearance in this series, in this season. So the man that Claire did surgery on is an actual real historical character. Now, the surgery was invented, but he was real, as was obviously Mr. Washington. But it does start to incorporate some of the real people who were in and around the story at this time.
Just like Murtaugh's group is based off of a militia group that ran down there. Swamp Fox, I believe he was called.
The regulators were actually, I was just in North Carolina and I didn't get a chance to do it yet. I still want to. But the regulators actually had one of the first major battles leading up to the Revolutionary War in North Carolina. Before the Boston Massacre, they were starting to be disenfranchised about the taxes and how, so all that whole storyline is very true and very historic. The regulators were a real group, and there was a battle. Although I think maybe that's the plot spoiler. Yeah, it is season 5. But they did attack a judge in Alamance County, which is just briefly mentioned by Lord Tryon, who is also another real character, a real person. He was the governor of North Carolina until 1776. And then he was moved to New York. So it's interesting how she weaves in these real people who were doing their real historic things in and around Claire and Jamie's and Brianna and Roger's stories. Interesting point. Stephen Bonnet is loosely based on a real pirate named Stede Bonnet, who ran up and down the South Carolina coast. Was imprisoned in Charleston. He was actually captured in Wilmington and sent to Charleston, where he was imprisoned and then later hanged.
Yeah, I was not. They picked a very charismatic actor for Stephen Bonnet, but man, what a cad.
He creeps me out.
He was.
Like, he's a fabulous actor, but it just...
He's trying to rape a bunch of people. It's hard to like him.
Rape aside, just how he interacts with all people and very, like, switch on a dime and...
I feel like I feel like in some ways he's a more charismatic Blackjack Randall, where Blackjack Randall was, like, a very hardline sadist, and there wasn't really that much, like, charm about him, or not me. I wouldn't call it, like, charisma. He was more just... What's the word I'm looking for? What really got me, too, watching this season with Stephen Bonnet now being kind of our main baddie, I know Ed Spielers from first Aragon and then from Downton Abbey, where both of which he plays very sweet, innocent, cleaner-cut young gentleman. And then he shows up here with his greasy, lanky hair, wreaks havoc on our heroes. And I mean, and he starts off the season, the first episode, they trust him initially. They help him out. And so I was like, oh, Ed, what are you doing here? What's up, my guy? And I was like, okay, like, you're a little shady, but, maybe you're a diamond in the rough. And then, oh boy, I think that casting worked perfectly, especially for me. Like, they cast someone who's not known for, like, villainous roles or anything like that. And then they got me. And he plays it with, you can tell he was having so much fun with that role. Like, he really went for it. The accent, the way he moves, the way he holds his body, the way he walks, the way he looks, like, it was a very transformative performance from him. So yeah, stellar performance from Ed Spielers.
I thought he looked familiar.
Yeah, I didn't place him at Downton Abbey until you said something, and I know exactly who he played.
Me too.
But yeah, he was totally transformative. I I never would have guessed that I had seen him before.
Which is proof he's got some acting chops, because that was quite different.
Absolutely.
Definitely against type for him.
He did kind of remind me at times, though, of Jack Sparrow. Like, I was expecting him to Johnny Depp the thing and just sail in on a ship and watch it sink. I mean, he kind of had that swagger, so I don't know. But I still
I think they're stereotyping the golden age of piracy when it got to that. The historical person that Karen was talking about was very charismatic and playing all sides. Anything to gain ultimate money or status. Let's face it, in that time period, status was everything. And sometimes you just had to buy your way to the top.
There's two things that I feel like we should mention and not forget. We've mentioned one reunion of Jamie and Child, but there was actually a first reunion of Jamie and Child when Lord John Grey, just passing through, just in the neighborhood, you know, wanting to peep Jamie, that's basically all it comes down to, brings Willie about, the child that he had with that one lady in season 3, whose name I forgot now because she died, and that's kind of how it works. What's her name?
Geneva.
Geneva, really?
Yeah, I think so.
Well, no wonder I didn't remember. Okay, I'll just remember as Switzerland. Anyway, Switzerland and Jamie had Willie, and Lord John Grey has been father to Willie. We learned that her sister, whose name I think was Charlotte, right? I don't know. Sister passed away. The one he married.
Wasn't it Isabel? I feel like it was Isabel.
Isabel.
Okay, Isabel. She passed away, we find out, and so he is now a widower. One of the things he kind of explains, it's important to mention this reunion, because not only does Jamie have a very complex sort of trip into the wilderness with young Willie, who he's trying to gauge, does Willie remember him or not? And it turns out Willie does. And there's this unspoken knowingness, I think, between the two of them. John gets the measles because the measles was part of this season. Everybody's getting the measles nowadays. And Claire decides to nurse him. And there is this hugely telling kind of sparkalicious scene between Claire and John Grey where she basically calls him out. You know why you're here. But they reach kind of an understanding and mutual respect with each other. And I thought that whole episode was really, really good and kind of paved the way for the bigger reunion later on with Brianna a little bit. So we got to see Willie, and he looked back at him. There was that whole question, why didn't you look back at me? Well, I wanted to. And then he looked back at him. So I hope to see Willie again.
And Karen and I know stuff.
Yeah, you can't say. No spoilers. That's
that one I can't say. It is a true spoiler.
Teasing. So that's one thing. I forgot what the second thing was. It was important.
In the realm of reunions, or maybe not.
It really was important. It had to do with the characters.
Well, you think about that. One thing I noticed while I was rewatching, when Jamie and Brianna are having their conversation about their respective assaults, one thing that I remember us talking about before in a previous podcast episode was the question of whether or not Jamie actually kills Blackjack. And in the conversation that they have, Jamie says, like, I woke up and he was on top of me and dead. He doesn't specifically remember killing him, but from the way that Jamie talks about it, he believes that he killed Blackjack. So, like, it's still not 100% for sure, #confirmed, that Jamie did indeed kill Blackjack Randall. But from the way that he talks about it, from that conversation with Brianna, Jamie believes that he killed him. So
Jamie actually thinks Murtaugh probably did it.
Like, in the series or in the books? Because from that conversation, it seems like Jamie believes that he's the one who killed.
In the books, he's not at all sure what happened.
Okay.
He doesn't remember. He's blocked it out. It is until a look, and I can't remember whether it's the 4th or 5th book, where he suspects that Murtaugh may have killed Randall. But he actually alludes to it in the series at one point that he wasn't in any shape to have killed Randall, but he's not sure. He doesn't remember. Blacked out.
But
And the fact that the head was facing him, the way the head was positioned, that would kind of be awkward if Jamie killed it because the head was facing him.
This might be a realization that comes out later, though, because I think Anna is absolutely right. At the time that he's talking with Brianna in this season, and she asks, he really does say something to the effect of, I think I did kill him, but I'm not sure. I woke up with his corpse on top of me. He doesn't go into speculation at all.
But I can confirm that Jamie did kill Blackjack, according to an article on The Hollywood Reporter with Tobias Menzies and the showrunner at the time, Ron Moore. They agreed that Jamie killed Blackjack.
Okay.
So they changed it from the book.
Not clear in the show, but clear behind the scenes that's
behind the scenes.
Yeah, that's what they say.
That's the storyline they decided.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So speaking of Tobias Menzies, the thing that I was trying to look up was we did get a brief reappearance of Frank Randall by virtue of memory. Tobias took a break from probably what was filming Game of Thrones to come back to this show. And so the question is, how did you like that episode? We got under the rounded edge of what happened to Tobias what happened to Frank after he stormed away from Claire that night.
I totally forgot about that episode.
Oh, so it left a good impression.
Well, I remember thinking in the moment of watching it that I liked that there was a different perspective. Like, then you have Brianna thinking she's the one who caused the accident.
Mm-hmm.
And neither one knows. But yeah, just with everything else, it didn't stick with me. And I adore him, so they could just bring him back all the time.
I think I skipped through that part because, I don't remember much of that.
Well, now he's Prince Philip, so I don't know how many times he's going to come back, but I enjoyed seeing him now. I mean, I enjoyed the episode, and I like that it gave Brianna a little bit more dimension again and kind of deepened that sort of the father that raised me versus the father that bore me kind of a thing. I liked that juxtaposition. Again, if you're invested in the Brianna character, as I apparently am becoming, that was a good episode, and it was nice to see Tobias again. Frank. Lots of good feedback. Okay, so now it's the time where I'd ask you, every episode, this is a catch-up series, we have to have our traditions, so it's time to rank the seasons thus far. I think I can already tell where this is going, but in context of your 1 through 4, compare and contrast, what's the best? Rank them. Go.
This is the most stressful part of these conversations every time.
I don't know why people keep saying that. This is fun for me. Go!
Our pain.
There's no pain. That's dramatic. Stop being dramatic.
Well, I have to think back to what I said the last time, too, because this one would clearly go at the bottom. I can't really remember what I said last time, other than I think it was like 3, 2, 1, probably. That sounds like something I would say. So probably 3, 2, 1, 4.
Bet you liked 3 the best, and then 2, and then 1? Or the other way around?
Yeah, what you said.
Okay. I don't think that's what you said, but
Really?
The only person that really talked about season 3 with like the most positivity was Karen, and that's because she associated it with book 3 being her favorite. Most everybody said either 2 or 1 and 2. I think you said 1 and 2 are kind of like a pair, and I can't really separate them.
That does sound like something I would say.
I know. I don't make these things up. Most people said 2 was their favorite, followed closely by 1, or that it was 1 and 2 they couldn't separate, and then 3.
I'll go 2, 1, 3, 4. Just because I like the scenes in 2. Some of the scenes are just outstanding.
I think for me it's a solid 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yep, I'm the same. 1, 2, 3, 4.
And I'm probably 2, 3, 1, 4.
Samantha, are you sticking with your 3, 2, 1, 4?
No. I'm with Kristen and Anna Laura. Like, that sounds right, but also my combo thing.
Okay.
Oh my.
You're just running out of having to give an actual answer, aren't you?
For real though, the 1 and 2 combo thing completely sounds like something I would say.
You did say it. I remember you saying that, and yeah.
And that's why you stick around to.
That's the purpose.
And then 3, and then 4.
I'm having trouble deciding between 3 and 4 because there are parts of 3 that I really like. There are parts of 4 that I really like, and then there are parts of 3 and 4 that I don't really like. Like the whole chapters aboard the ship in 3, when everybody was catching the disease. That just left me feeling bored at the time, as I recall, but I did like a lot of things around it, and they're as problematic as 4 can be. There are some very satisfying story payoffs in this season. Now, I will have you note that they still have not explained the standing stone magic. They keep finding new standing stones, and they tell me that gems will get you through the stones, but they don't tell me why. So I'm very interested in that answer. Still haven't told me. I'm going to cheat my own system, and I'm going to put 1 and 2, I'm going to combo them now. 1 and 2 are one thing.
Thing to do.
Yeah. I like them the best, and then 3 and 4, I like them the next best. I think I'll have to wait and see how other seasons unfold. Before I said I liked 2 a little more than 1. Now I'm colored through the perspective of season 4 was in no way set in Scotland at any time, and now I'm really missing Scotland. So why can't we go back to this? Right. Why can't we go back to the country of the show? So that's kind of why I'm thinking 1 and 2. What?
I felt like a Scottish show, and that's kind of like one of the reasons that I got into it, because I was like, oh, this show is about Scotland. That interests me. I don't know a lot about the history of Scotland. And so not only did I feel like the storytelling was a bit better at that time, like it was just more intriguing to me because I was learning more. It was more stuff that I was unfamiliar with. And then now, we're getting to American colonial history, which has, the history of the Revolutionary War as a good American kid has been hammered into my brain. So I'm kind of like, you know what? I've been here, done that.
Which raises an amazing question, because I literally thought to myself, okay, if I am a viewer who is Scottish or English or Irish and I'm watching these seasons, do I get the same enjoyment, like season 4? Do I get the same enjoyment learning about American colonial past that an American would have, such as the 6 of us, watching the Scottish history and the English versus the Scottish pieces unfold in Outlander?
Just remember
people to ask, but I don't think it translates that way. Like, I don't think they find us interesting like we find them interesting.
Sarah's not here, but if she were, she would say, if you're Scottish and you watch Outlander and you've seen up through season 4, tweet at us at CPU Podcast and let us know what you think about this American colonial period and Outlander's presentation.
Remember that we started out as a penal colony, and who did they kick out of the British Isles? The Irish, the Scotch, and the Welsh. And where did they settle? They settled in Appalachia because it reminded them most of home. You have to remember that during this period, there were still forests over there. There were still old-growth forests. And when they came here, Appalachia felt most home. And so when they kicked them out, and there's the whole indentured service and all of that, which they only hinted very little to. And that's one of the things that gets pulled out of our history books is indentured servants and how it fell in between slavery and free. And so when you look at a lot of the names in the Revolutionary War, they seem to be Irish Scotch.
No, I get
a lot of them.
You and I, and probably all 6 of us, all know that. But that's what I'm saying, and that's what Anna just said. We've learned this in some version multiple times throughout our history. Like, I find this less interesting to watch in my escapist fantasy, is all I'm saying. Yes.
When I lived in Ireland, we took Irish history from their perspective. And you would be surprised on how much they know more than we do about our own history.
No, that wouldn't surprise me at all.
Education in this country. Are you kidding me? I was also thinking it's possible because America has, like, American media is big, like, worldwide. Like, I mean, I know Americans have an overblown view of our own influence, but I feel like the amount of media that has been made about the American Revolution versus, say, you know, the Scottish Jacobite uprisings, like, there's just more made about the American Revolution generally from just even just like a media aspect, like not even considering what history is taught in schools where, or, you know, anything like that. I literally can count on one hand the amount of shows that I've watched, this one about the Jacobite uprisings, but the amount of media that I've consumed or seen that exists, that I know exists about American colonialism or the American Revolution or American frontiersmanship is just, there's the amount that's been made about those subjects versus Scottish history, or at least that's widespread in America.
Over there, they don't even call it a war. It wasn't a war to them, to be honest. It was just a conflict. And they basically walked away, is how they view it. They wanted to be free, fine. They see more trouble than they're worth. That's how it's viewed over there.
That's hilarious to me because Americans obviously have a very different...
Oh, of course we do. That's when we were over there. It was very enlightening to see how self-important Americans think they are in the world, like you were saying, and how they're like, yeah, we just didn't want to spend the money.
Yeah.
God bless to be gone. I mean, they're still one of our strongest allies. Hello. If we were really...
Are they still? That's a whole other podcast.
Well,
current circumstances aside.
Oh, okay.
We're not going to go down that road.
Thank you. All I'm saying is, escapist fantasy meets American Revolution. I don't need it. I don't need it.
And that was the interesting thing about, especially, I mean, I just rewatched it just in the last week in preparation for our discussion. And without getting too election-y, just with everything going on with COVID and Black Lives Matter, it felt it didn't feel historical to me. A lot of it, I was sitting back and like, some stuff just hasn't changed. Like the dynamics between Brianna and Roger, and I feel like double standard stuff. It was just like, 200-something years, and
I feel like for me, I definitely agree with you there, Samantha, where a lot of the things that are depicted in the show, like the gender dynamics between Brianna and Roger, and then later with Jamie and the way that he's treating Brianna with her sexual assault, or the way that, they're interacting with the indigenous peoples, or the way that they're interacting with the African American and enslaved characters. Some attitudes have not changed, but also on the flip side, from the way that the show is depicting these things, like watching the episodes, particularly Do No Harm, where they're at Jacasta's plantation, like watching that and being like, to me, I know there are differing opinions on how effective that episode was as far as representation, but I know from the critics of color that have written on that episode particularly, as well as just how Outlander depicts slavery as a whole, it left a lot wanting, and to me it feels very white saviory, and I feel like it's a step in representation, but I feel like there are many, many more steps that need to be taken, and Outlander, because it is a show that's still going, does have the opportunity to step it up. In those regards, they have the opportunity to bring on more consultants and writers of color to flesh out their behind-the-scenes teams so that they can portray these sensitive issues in a well-rounded and in a sensitive way. So while I'm disappointed so far in the way that they have depicted those things, I hope that they listen to the criticisms that have been levied against them and try to improve.
At this point, is there anything that we haven't covered before I ask the $1 million question? Is there anything that we haven't covered that you feel we should cover about season 4 of Outlander?
The unsung set designers, costume, music designers.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, you bring this up as an afterthought, but you mentioned it all the time.
Well, because it doesn't fall in, you're always talking storylines. And when we talk about the historical accuracy, we kind of go more about the people and not about the sets, which are fabulous, getting that frontier feel. Absolutely love that they put the bison in there. There was bison on this side of the Appalachians. They have since all been killed. There's pieces that get overlooked, and I come back to this because I am a techie in theater, and it's always the overlooked. It's always about the actors and their storylines. But if that music score wasn't as strong as it was, would you have the same feelings that incites when things happen? Culloden. When they did Culloden, the music for that was just heartrending. And they really try to do mostly historical outfits.
One thing, when I initially watched this series, the first time as it was airing, reading about Terry Dresbach and her research that she did for the costumes, not only what the Frontiers people would be wearing and the way that they, reused old clothes, repurposed, and all that stuff. So we're seeing elements of older outfits that are cropping up in different ways and newer outfits, but especially the research that she did for dressing the indigenous peoples, because as a white creative, it would have been relatively easy for her to just fall back on past depictions and the kind of, in my opinion, relatively low expectations that most people have for depicting those cultures. But she did do the research and filled in the gaps where she had to, which was a lot, but consulted people from those communities in order to make sure that she was portraying them in an authentic way and getting the stamp of approval from cultural leaders from those communities. I thought that was really well done of her, and it adds so much to the series. The fact that these are rich and visually interesting worlds, and it adds so much to the story and to the characters and the feel of the world.
Just for the record, we're not reserved just to story here. I may not ask specific talking point questions, but you can always bring up whatever you appreciate or don't appreciate about a TV show.
There's just so much.
I know.
There's a lot happening.
There's so much, and I'm not sure how many people really care about costume design. Unless it's over the top or way off, most people don't even care about hair, and it's those details. The fact Claire never wears a hat or a scarf, but Brianna does, and she doesn't have any problem with it. It's those little details that become more authentic, because I heard a lot of people today struggled with authenticity, that, I don't think it was really like that then, or that type of thing. Coming from a historic background, it's something that I enjoy.
I think there is, I follow on Twitter and Instagram a lot of stuff, and TikTok now that I've joined that, I'm addicted now. There are a lot of people, and a lot of young people, people my age who are in their 20s, lower to mid 20s, and even people in their teens who are interested in historical dress.
Usually to cross with steampunk.
Sometimes,
yeah.
But there is a really rich online community of people who are interested in historical dress, historical costuming, learning about the way that people from different eras lived their lives and how they dressed and all that stuff. Unfortunately, some people do use that to gatekeep, and oftentimes they can use it to try to dismiss a show that is maybe trying diverse casting or something like that. Right now, the first look photos and teaser trailer for Bridgerton has just been released, and that has a diverse cast, and it has, I would say, more historically inspired costumes. They're very colorful, they're artistically very rich, but maybe aren't necessarily super historically authentic, but that's not the point. And so sometimes I think people use that as an excuse to dismiss diverse casting or, something like that. So that's an unfortunate side of that for sure. But I think there is definitely a pretty sizable community of people who are interested in this, who are keeping that history alive.
So I'm a little confused because you're mixing clothing with diversity. And I don't understand why a diverse cast wouldn't wear period correct. I don't get your...
So in certain cases, and this is just one example that I brought up. So in certain cases, a movie or a TV show might choose to utilize diverse casting, race-blind casting. And so far, most of those have been historically based, but not super tied to historical accuracy. They're not necessarily trying to create a realistic world. Like, this is exactly how this would have been, Like, so other examples would be The Great or The Personal History of David Copperfield, where it's highly stylized and it's potentially a little bit ahistorical. But you see a series will have a diverse cast, and people who don't want to support that will often use artistic things such as costuming to try to dismiss this series as a whole. Just be like, oh, well, that's not historically accurate. So I'm throwing the bucket out with the water, essentially.
So from my perspective, if you set something based historically and your clothes are 2 centuries off, that means people didn't research, because I've seen it. I've seen where they've said it's, based on a real story. Why would you not be accurate with the clothing and be 2 centuries off or not even close?
So I think there's a difference between that and, like, for instance, in Rain, where they're basically just wearing, like, Forever 21 prom dresses. That annoys me to no end. But there are instances where it's, like, you have the silhouette, like the right silhouette. You have a lot of the necessary, like, base elements, but it's a stylistic choice that the costumers made. To use an example from Outlander, the red dress from season 2, it is technically anachronistic because it doesn't have a lot of the elements that a real 100% historically accurate 18th century dress would have. It doesn't have any trim, it doesn't have any frills,
because she was poor.
A lot of the layers. But, well, Cherry Dresbach said one of the reasons that she designed that dress the way she did was you have the 18th century silhouette, but with a mid-century, mid-20th century style added to it. She was like, I would think that Claire was inspired by, like, the new look where you have more simple lines and less frills and stuff like that. So it's a stylistic choice a lot of the time.
Okay, so I'm going to point out that I was a history teacher. And kids would watch these movies, and they would come in because they knew I did this, and they would say, hey, that dress, it was fantastic. And I go, that's not even historically accurate. But they watched a movie that said it was historically accurate. So when should someone take responsibility for making a story? And Outlander is completely, I know, it's pretty much fantastical. But when these kids watch movies and they come and believe that that's what really happened, we are not doing a service to educate people on what it was like. Like they say medieval times, they didn't wash. They washed all the time. This whole idea that they were dirty and covered with stuff, completely ridiculous. But that's how people view time periods based off of TV, movies. And when someone puts extra effort in being more period correct, that's an astounding thing.
That's true, but I think a lot of these series or movies that people are going for this reason, they're being very upfront about the fact that they're not 100% historically accurate. Like, for instance, The Great had their title card literally has an asterisk that says an occasionally true story. Literally in the title card, they're like, hey, this is a very comedic, satirical look at history. And people still complained about inaccuracy. Like, they literally told you, like, hey, we're playing fast and loose with the historical fact here. And people still came for them. So, and in the same case with Bridgerton, it's based off a romance series. It's not meant to be realistic. It's meant to...
What about the other Boleyn girl?
The other Boleyn girl, that one I think would fall into more what you're talking about, where it was, I think the other Boleyn girl, and like I would count the Tudors or Reign or, you know, those other ones, where they're taking themselves way too seriously. Anybody who knows anything about history is going to know to not go there for historical accuracy. But yeah, people who don't know much about those time periods might take them more seriously.
I'm going to have to referee here a little bit because I feel like we're, again, way far off the railroad track of the topic, which is Outlander. So if you want to keep talking about historical accuracy of costuming across properties, we can do that offline. But we got to bring it back to Outlander. So to Lori's point, I think what you're saying is you appreciate the overall general accuracy of Outlander's visual presentation, be it art direction, the setting, and the costuming, correct?
And use of period instruments.
And use of period instruments to create the music, which, to round it out and kind of bring an endpoint to this, if the theme song over the entirety of season 4 has a colonial Americana backdrop to it with banjos and a little bit of bluegrass hidden underneath the Scottish lyrics based on the poem by Robert Louis or whoever it was. So, all right. Well, now I'm going to force moderate into the next question, the best question, the question of every podcast panel we ask, which is, having, now that we're at the end of season 4, and granted, probably everybody's caught up besides me, would you recommend Outlander upon the end of season 4? Why or why not?
I would, based on the person's interest. So at this point, I wouldn't recommend it to everyone, but if they dig historical stuff and fantasy stuff and a little bit of sci-fi stuff, I would recommend it.
I completely agree with Samantha. I wouldn't recommend it broad spectrum to everybody. I think it would definitely be to specific people who are interested in this kind of thing or have interests in this general type of show. Yeah, still would.
I don't know. I feel torn because obviously, like, if they're going to be watching season 4, they're going to have watched the first 3 seasons, hopefully. Otherwise, they're going to be real confused. So I would say, like, if one of my friends had watched through the end of season 3 and was like, hey, is it worth it to keep watching? I would say, on the whole, yeah. I mean, I did. I would just give, like, you know, with the caveat that there's probably going to be some things that are disappointing and or frustrating.
I'd say that probably sums up my thoughts too. I would recommend it to people who like historically accurate dramas, who like romance, who like things of this sort, with the caveat that watch it, but understand that things get a little disjointed as it goes on. But hang in there. It gets better.
I was going to say something to that attune that season 4 is set up for season 5, and season 5 is great. I like season 5. I like where it goes.
Oh, teaser. Whatever I've said before, I think is where I'm at with Outlander. I think Outlander is a very specific milieu, which is pretty much, yes, historical fiction / if you love your romance novels with the bare-chested guys on the romance novels and the lady fainting in his arms, this is that kind of romance. It's just got a little bit, it's a lot less superficial. It's got more depth. It's got more rounded out tidness because of the fact that it's set against real historical backdrops, and there is a time travel piece. And of course, I'm interested in the time travel piece, so if I get an answer to this, if I don't get an answer to this, I'm going to just come back and yell at all of you, but if I do get an answer to this, I'll be very, very happy. I think if you're like me and you like sort of the sci-fi fantasy aspect the most, then this is really right up your alley, because all of the other thing is just the icing on a very nice banana split at this point. So, with that said, is there, and again, leaving aside that other conversation for a moment, is there anything else that you wish to say about season 4 of Outlander before we call it a night? They're all looking at me like she's giving us the stink eye. Well, hearing nothing, hearing no additional thoughts on at least season 4 of Outlander, what I like to do now is thank Lori and Samantha and Kristen and Karen and Anna Laura for joining me once again. But you know, this catch-up series isn't over. There's still one more season to catch up on. Before we get there, though, we have to roll our credits. Couch Potatoes Unite! Exclamation point was produced by Back Pocket Productions, run by yours truly, the Chief Couch Potato, which is really another way of saying executively produced by me, Kylie Piette. My associate producers are Krista Pennington and Selene Rezmer. I edit this podcast, and our logo is by Rebecca Wallace. Our marketing graphic artist is Krista. Our theme song was written by Sarah Milbratz and sung by Sarah, Amy McDaniel, and Kels Rezmer. Kels played the keyboard, Ian McDonough played the bass, Christian Somerville played the guitar, and the whole shebang was engineered by Kyle Aspinall and Christian. We hail from Grand Rapids, Michigan. Please, if you like what you hear, take the time to rate us, give us stars, provide comments, or review us wherever you get your podcasts. Apple, Stitcher, Spotify, iHeartRadio, CastBox, and Amazon are just a few of the places you can find us, but we're also on YouTube. We have our website, and we're now on Patreon at patreon.com/couchpotatoesunite. If you really love us, pledge your support by becoming one of our United Couch Potatoes as we grow our little sofa-populated corner of the world. Otherwise, feel free to tell us how we're doing, what we should add, subtract, keep, or toss. You know how it goes. And if you have suggestions for shows we might consider, contact us at our website where we have a guest book, by email at couchpotatoesunitepodcast@gmail.com, our Facebook, our Twitter at CPU Podcast, our Instagram at Couch Potatoes Unite, our Patreon, or wherever you get your podcasts. Though, of course, we add new and old shows to chat about around the water cooler all the time, and always have new episodes coming down the pipe. Just listen to our intros. If you miss old episodes or want to know in general what shows we cover, just search for us. Find us wherever you do searchable things on the internet. Don't forget that exclamation point, or contact us via our website, our email, our social media accounts, and our Patreon to stay up on all the new events and episodes by our humble little podcast, Couch Potatoes Unite! Exclamation point. Until the next time, the first 3 seasons of Outlander are available to stream on Netflix, while seasons 4 and 5 are available through a subscription to Starz, either directly or via add-on to outlets like Amazon Prime. And of course, none of these people are sponsoring us, so we're not endorsing them. We're just trying to be a helpful resource here. In the meantime, our Outlander panel will next reconvene, very shortly in fact, to talk season 5 and episode 5 of our 5-part catch-up series. So until next time, until next episode, new episodes are published every Wednesday. Keep listening, keep watching, stay tuned!
Bye.